On the next slide here, moving forward, then moving on the next slide, we talk about union affiliation by race, and compared to the averages, it looks like the lowest density, especially in the male population, is among the Asian population. Hispanics are just above that, with just over 10% themselves. 1 out of 10 Hispanic workers across our country belonging to a union. The highest density being in the African American population, nearly 16% of those in male, just over 14% in the female. Rick, are the unions really that aggressive as far as meeting or matching up the demographic in order to try to gain the loyalty by race structure and characteristic of race?
Well, Dan, every time that there's a organizing campaign, and this is when we put together the curriculum for the Organizers Institute, this is one of the things that we really put a lot of energy into. It's one of the first things in the learning process when a union is targeting a company is to look at the demographics and match them up. Yes, they are not only, as we stated earlier, really pushing for younger people and young blood to come into the union movement. It's the minorities and a strong diversity across the rank and file and up into organizing and as officers. They're really pushing that. So when they have an organizing campaign, the first thing they would do is to match up the organizing team with the demographics that are working inside the facility.
Stephan, though, with your tenured experience, 35 years working with global companies, what is your response as far as what you saw as a challenge for the employer in order to match that characteristic and having the appropriate demographic among the leadership in consideration of the demographic of the working class?
Yeah, Dan, that's very important to companies. As you mentioned earlier, I was with part of the Toyota family with Toyota Industries North America. But we kept very close eyes. We would watch our demographics very closely and see if there's any trends coming. And we definitely tried to meet those trends by either having the leadership individuals with either from the ethnic or background, or we'd also look at where the population may be rising to make sure we had good leaders that were in that particular background, whether genetically or by race. And that's something that you have to do as an employer because you have to be able to communicate with your workforce. And if you don't have the right people who understand and can communicate appropriately and understand what your employees want, then you're going to get in an area where you've lost contact, and you're not going to understand those values and those problems those employees are having. So all companies today are watching their demographics very closely to make sure they have the proper leaders in place, to make sure they have the good communication programs, and that they are meeting the needs and expectations of the workforce. So multinational and global companies today are watching these statistics very closely.
Dan, I like to add one thing also, is that when a union is looking at the foundation of the company, one of the first things that they'll look at is when there is a strong minority presence working within a facility, and they'll look at the frontline supervisor team also to see if there's a lot of, say for instance, if there's a lot of Hispanics, Latino workers within a facility. They will look at the frontline supervisory team, and are they also do they also have Hispanic workers or Latino workers within the management structure, especially the frontline supervisors, because that is one of the weaknesses, and it's logical, as Stephan has stated, it's logical, and companies are getting much smarter about placing, whether it be Asian or Latino or African American or whatever race, that a majority of the workforce is to matching that up with their supervisory force. But in many, many cases, all too often, we're still seeing a case where language is a barrier to how you communicate with your employees, and that makes it red meat for the unions when they come in, and it becomes a true us against them mentality.
You know, Rick, I can appreciate that. I think to take that one step farther, though, I'd like to ask you the question concerning, as we mentioned, as a firm in adopting the motto of being able to alter corporate DNA, that has to be a challenge to companies, not to be so much nearsighted to see that it takes so much more than just having someone who speaks Spanish. Companies really must take into account the cultural habits and likelihoods associated with different dialects or cultural indifferences, and to gain an appreciation of those facts when it comes to the customs of their workers. Wouldn't you agree that there is somewhat of a challenge like that in America?
Dan, I tell you what, that is paramount. It is paramount that having a workforce that is productive, that the longevity of the workers is good, and even I'll take it one step further. It's not just to place workers who have the same culture and language as the workforce, but to do it with quality people. Too many times we see that we will make the attempt to put people on the line and in those positions in management, but just to put someone with that culture or the language skills is not enough. They have to be quality people who really understand how to communicate with the workforce. And I'm not talking about language. I'm not talking, I'm talking about the skills to communicate with them and to solve issues and solve problems, and just like any other workforce, is to communicate properly with them, not just because they have the language skills, but they have to be quality people.
Very good. Moving on, gents, let's talk about union affiliation by state. The geography of our country, certainly we see where density of union involvement or union interest is greater than in some others. In some ways we talk about the North versus the South, but this slide demonstrates the highest density first of unionization or union affiliation. New York certainly is the greatest density, with more than 1 out of every 4 workers in the state of New York affiliated with unions. Alaska, Hawaii, Washington, Michigan, California, even down through Illinois. On the low end of that perspective, though, we have North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, all having less than 1 out of 20 workers being affiliated with a union, followed by Tennessee, Virginia, Idaho, Texas, South Dakota, and Mississippi. Rick, in the eyes of the union, though, how do they look at this type of data as the land of opportunity for them, and how do they adjust accordingly in order to try to find the best return on their time investment?
Well, what they're doing a lot more now, Dan, and this is something that's always been a challenge, is going and, because in the past what unions have done traditionally is they'll go into an area and they will organize a facility or a company and then leave, and then come back when they wanted to organize another company or another hospital. And what they're doing more and more now is that they're going into areas and they're setting up camp in those areas. In other words, they're building a force within those areas, within a region, within a city, and building up the support over a longer period of time. But having that said, there's also in the next coming years we're going to see changes in these numbers also, because we're seeing now that the labor force is much more fluid. We're seeing people who are uprooting from cities and states where they've lived their whole life and going, in search for new jobs or better jobs. They're going all over the country. So the workforce is much more fluid also. So we're going to see these numbers jumble up also in the coming years.
And certainly I think part of that as well is that unions know where their stronghold may be, and they're not going to sit on their laurels to think that that's just going to be granted to them. If, for instance, in New York or even in Rhode Island or Chicago, say for instance, where they have a great density of unionization, it's easy in a wheel and spoke to try to encourage that loyalty among neighboring facilities. And Stefan, I guess I'll ask you, as far as the global economics of things, where we are becoming more of a global enterprise, so to speak, on a competitive level, as foreign interests are coming to the U.S. to establish business here, I'm sure they look at this data and somewhat to figure out where perhaps that next manufacturing plant's going to be, or where geographically they would put their operation, knowing the background of unionization or the probability. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, no, I do, Dan, and that's right. Companies do look at where they would think they'd have the least threat for putting in a new facility. And Rick has alluded to, there's a lot of traveling now from the north to the south, so employers have to be aware of that there's union members who will be coming with that company if they relocate from the north. But another thing employers have to be very conscious about, those lower states like North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina that you have listed here are also ripe for unionization because the people don't understand things about a union. So they could be easily misled or misguided into thinking a union is the best thing since motherhood and apple pie. So employers have to stay proactive, and they can't take anything for granted. Just because you have a low union membership percentage-wise, there's a lot of vulnerability in that area. So employers have to be very careful and cautious just by thinking, well, we can locate there because it won't follow us there. That's not the case today. And as Rick had pointed out in several cases, unions are becoming smarter. How they're campaigning is different. It's not the old-fashioned way. They're getting young men and women who are the same generation, have the same ideas, and they're bringing them into those areas also. So you always have to be on guard. You can't take anything for granted.